And thanks to NCPT for holding this and getting us all together and allowing me to speak. I'm going to take a different approach from Frank, and I'm going to be repeating some things about this because tumacacori is a fabulous laboratory, and so I'm going to get into that. And I just want to say that Hugh Miller was talking about when in the 70s when Jim Askins and all this business about the exhibit specialist started, and I came in as an exhibit specialist. My whole career was as an exhibit specialist, and so that's basically a practitioner. And the term is kind of hard to understand, but my career in the Park Service was hands-on and project management out there, and so the point of view that I'm taking about this subject is from that point of view. And to pick up where some of the things that Frank had talked about, let's see, how does this work? Okay, what's going on here? Pardon me? I can use this. There we go, okay. Okay, we're talking about the Earthen architecture sites, and particularly Adobe and the pre-Columbian sites. And the sites I'm going to focus on there are Fort Union, Pecos, Casa Grande, of course, tumacacori. I might get around to mentioning Fort Bowie and Fort Davis, and I'm not going to get down here. But these are sites in which earthen architecture is predominant. And as Frank said, things did start at Casa Grande, and I'm going to try not to repeat too much of what he said. But Casa Grande is a puddled earth as distinguished from adobe brick. And so that's a very important distinction, and it's a remarkable place that was constructed sometime around 1200 AD and abandoned around 1400 or so. And so the thing that always struck me when I went to work at Casa Grande was, what happened between 1400 and 1891, and how did this place survive in this condition that it's in over here? And as we get into this, we discover a few things about it. But and we think about this, of course, this is all not National Park Service, but General Lands Office was in charge of all this kind of stuff up until 1916. And so, in 1891, when this was set aside, 1889, it was first recognized in a Congress declaration to repair and protect the ruin of Casa Grande. It's 127 years ago. So if it hadn't been for this 100th anniversary, I would have titled this paper 127 Years of Earth and Architecture Preservation. But in any case, when in 1891, the Congress sent $2,000 to this project. So this is remarkable at the beginning, to see this. And they had 6 things on their mind to do down there: to put up a protective fence, to get a site management custodian, to clean the site, underpin basal erosion, to cap exposed walls, to reinforce freestanding walls, and to develop a sheltering roof plan for the structure. And so, and then you can see some of this in this lower picture here where work has already gotten underway. And, it's a pretty heavy-handed treatment of brick and cement and mortar around here, and construction of doorways and infills and things. And and even today, this stuff is still in place, and maybe there's a question about what the effect of that is. But the major impact of the site comes in when the shelter goes up, and the first shelter was in 1902, this kind of barn-like shelter that went up, and then in 1932, this contest to build a new shelter over the ruin, and of course won by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. We talked about him yesterday here in the meeting. And this is, of course, the famous shelter that you hear worldwide. Please, let's don't have a shelter like Casa Grande. I mean, you hear this all across the National Park Service. Whenever in the Southwest region, where I was working in the Division of Conservation, we'd go out to a park and recommend, could you consider a shelter over this ruin? The first thing the superintendent would say, not like Casa Grande. And it was really interesting to me. It's been interesting to me over my career how this has engendered so much negativity when you actually go on site and start to confront the monument itself. The structure tends to disappear, believe it or not, and if you have never been there. And so I think, well, it's here to stay anyway. It's a National Historic feature in its own right. So there's nothing going to happen to that. But, and of course, Frank Boss Pinkley was behind all of this, and one of his first job was for the General Lands Office at Casa Grande, and was responsible for taking care of all of this. And in 1910, he made this quote, "From which there seems to be no practical method to protect the greater part of them," speaking about the walls at Casa Grande. And so even early on, the sense is that even with this shelter, that with wind and rain and whatnot, this earthen architecture structure was going to be very difficult to preserve. Then, I want to move on right now back up to Tumacacri, and Frank was very eloquently talked about the planning issues there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the material things and look at this. And when Boss Pinkley went up here, and I like to see the contrast between Casa Grande and Tumacacri and what he did, because he'd been a participant in the shelter at Casa Grande, but he had no intention of thinking about that in this location, here. And I'm not sure of all of what the reasoning was, but of course, as Frank said, the main thing done was to reconstruct this and then reconstruct the roof over the nave, which ostensibly really did save the building. But the other thing that to think about here about preservation too is that luckily the building was encased in a lime plaster exterior, and that's a great preservative for Adobe brick. Now the thing is that as a ruin, it had this kind of disrupted surface in a lot of places, and I think it's really interesting. Frank talked about this. There's a lot to think about here about where to stop and where to start with this repair. And we know over the 100 years or so, not quite, but that there's been a lot of replastering on Tumacacri and lime plaster, very sympathetic, and always with a sense of trying to maintain this kind of partial restored effect. And a lot of things in the literature about that, and to think about this being done in the 1920s, a little bit advanced, a little ahead of that Athens Charter in 1933 or whenever it was, that sort of got into all of this. And it's interesting to me to think that some of these thoughts were at work then. And just to show another aspect of that, and I won't go into it. Frank mentioned about Southwest Monuments, and I think that's a very important step in the Park Service development of management of sites and ruin sites and archaeological sites in the Southwest. And Frank Boss Pinkley certainly was a manager who coalesced a whole program around that, for sure, to get funds out of Washington to come down and treat these things, because ruins in the Park Service have been a real stepchild for getting funding out of the Washington office. It's been a problem, and Pinkley understood that. In 1930, we start to see the Washington, D.C., the Washington office issued the following notice. The National Park Service is seeking means of protecting Pueblo ruins from weathering. Well, they're including, that's a name for all the ruins in the Southwest, including Tumacacri. The ideal solution would be a transparent waterproof coating which could be sprayed on the walls, but no suitable product has been found, and the service announced today it would welcome suggestions for a substitute. So here in 1930, the Washington office is putting out a call to find some treatments for these adobe walls, because now I don't have to explain to anybody in this room that, adobe's made of earth. You put it out in the weather, guess what? It's a downhill slide. So in response to this, the Standard Oil Corporation in 1932 came up with something called soil bitumen 1 and emulsified asphalt, and it started to find some use around in some sites, some experimental use. Stanford University responded with an experimental vinyl resin. They labeled it NPSX, began to be applied in 1935, and it was applied to the exterior and interior nave surfaces of Tumacacri. Unfortunately, in my records in looking at this, I didn't really find hard data to say exactly what, where, and how all these things were done. But as the years went by, and by 1940, and probably Pinkley had something to do with this meeting. I don't know if he attended it or not, but there was a meeting in Santa Fe here at the headquarters we were at last night of managers from Washington and Pinkley or whoever. I think Pinkley was there. The basic deficiency, and this came out of this meeting, a several days meeting. The basic deficiency is material. It is highly probable that superior methods of application will quickly follow the development of suitable materials. Existing stabilization measures are founded almost entirely upon the use of native soils, cement mortar as capping, cement mortar and sewer mortar masonry, and particularly at Chaco Canyon, native soil stabilized with bitumen. A single attempt to apply modern plastics was made between 1933 and 1935, which consisted largely of an experimental work and which, failing to recognize the physics and mechanics inherent in the problem, resulted in little, if any, positive value. And in concluding this little section, it must be supplemented by materials of different characteristics, which probably will be found only in the developments of industrial chemistry. The resins and silicon ester in particular appear to offer hope for an eventual solution. So, fascinating that it started. And also, I think it's interesting that the silicon ester was mentioned that early, because it wasn't until sometime in the late 70s or 80s, I think it's Giacomo Chiari, that actually did a scientific thing with silicon ester and showed at Chan where, this really works to stabilize Adobe in a certain way, as let's say as a conservation surface treatment. And also during the 40s and during this wartime period and in the 40s, the use of what became known as soil cement in the Southwest was spreading around. And this is basically just Portland cement mixed with soil as a stabilizer. And of course, during the war, not a whole lot happened. And this is sort of distinguished as a treatment from a spray-on treatment like we will see in a moment. Just as an aside, I think Tumacacri is such a rich site, and there's so much to find there. This Cocho Pesto, which is a Greco-Roman 400 BC lime-stabilized coating made with crushed ceramic, can be found at Tumacacri. It's probably the only place in the United States where you can find this. I just thought it was fascinating. Doesn't have much to do with the Adobe. In 1946, a survey at Tumacacri, again, identified some issues: Adobe basal's deterioration, apparent widening of cracks, plaster deterioration at the mission, and painted surfaces were also surveyed and looked at. This project represents the first application of art conservation methods towards architectural fabric within a ruins context in the Southwest, at least from my reading. And in this first effort to work on those interior walls, they were using, I think, polyvinyl acetate. Now, jumping ahead quite a bit, in 1971, the University of Arizona soil scientist was tasked with researching moisture problems at the walls of Tumacacri. And rather than simply continuing to treat a symptom, an effort to understand the cause of the problem was behind this request. And I think this is interesting, where it's beginning to look holistically at these systems of walls, the surfaces of plasters, and the whole 9 yards. What's the source of the moisture? What's the quantity? How does it move in the materials? What can be done to address the problem? By 1975, the fundamentals of a new approach, including laboratory material analysis, recognition of the process of deterioration, monitoring of rate of change, increased levels of documentation, multidisciplinary team approach, the critical review were being put in, and a critical review was being put into place. A plan emerged, which included a more judicious application of conservation materials, which could be scientifically evaluated through monitoring. This was a time when acryloid B72 was used down there at Casa Grande. And of course, all this sort of ends up with the work that Tony Crosby did of the idea of reattaching plasters to Adobe, which became to be quite an interesting sort of problem. In 1955, the preservation workers at both Casa Grande and Tumacacri were using Daracone, stepping back a little bit here, an industrial silicone-based waterproofing product, a spray-on product. And these spray-on products kept cropping up over and over again during the the 50s and into the 60s as being a kind of a cure-all for the Adobe, with the hope that, you could just come out and get your sprayer with some materials and in this case the Daracone and just various silicone products, and spray them and have a very quick job of it. And they had a very positive response for about a month or two until the rains hit. None of this ever lasted more than a year, and so it became really, really hopeless. Failures just continued. And about that time in the late 60s, another product came on the market, a Darroweld C. It was known as, it's still in use to some extent, and it began to replace this because it could be not only sprayed on the Adobe but also intermixed with earthen materials. And I haven't really talked, I'm not going to talk about Chaco, Mesa Verde, and all these other sites, but all of these was the same problem, trying to stabilize earthen materials, whether it be mortar or the Adobe. Now, jumping ahead, Pecos National Historical Park was established in 1965, Pecos National Monument at the time, and it's an extensive adobe ruin, which is a Spanish colonial mission structure set on top of pre-Columbian Pueblo with a convento, all built out of adobe, and of course a lot of stone foundations there and stone bases. The original Pueblo is stone and earth. And, of course, all the same problems here, too, right away. And in the 60s, this energy is really underway. And the archaeologist in 1974 wrote, "But I think that the basic problem then and now even remains the same. We do not yet know how to stabilize and preserve exposed adobe, earth, and walls. A lot of people in and out of the Park Service have and are working on the problem, and progress is being made, but we have a long way to go." And so I think at Pecos, the history is quite interesting in that encapsulation of the originally historic walls became the modus operandi there. And it developed in a series of experimental applications until where it was decided that the best treatment was to use an adobe veneer brick to encapsulate the historic walls. And over time, the mixtures of those adobe bricks became modified to a certain extent. And most recently, with the EC330 Roplex, an acrylic emulsion, I'll talk about that in a minute, which was sort of a competitor to the Darroweld C. And it's continued to today. And in my work, I'm actually involved out there now. We have a couple of little test walls because it's really interesting to try to understand exactly what's happening behind those acrylic modified veneer walls at Pecos. And so the experimentation is still underway. And I'm working with the VT program on a little study out there with the park. Now, jumping over to another example that is completely different but extremely interesting. I don't know if Jerry Rogers is here, but Jerry Rogers got his start up at Fort Davis, which is a fabulous earthen architecture site, 19th century fort. And the thing that happened at Fort Davis was that there was the ruins that were found there when it became a part, I think in 1965 or 56, I'm not sure. In any case, what we find there is that there were partial ruins, a lot of pieces were intact. And so they made this decision when they first started at Fort Davis that if you had approximately 60% of the building intact, partial restoration would follow. Fix the roof, put back the porch, stabilize the walls, but restrained. No windows, no doors, very limited. Sections like this were left in ruins. And so they went around the fort and did this, and it's remarkable, the preservation at Fort Davis, because the interior of these structures have these great paints from the 19th century, original plasters and paints from the Army period. And we have to thank Jerry and his team who made this decision. And so it's an interesting side. There's not a whole lot of, what happens there with these ruins is they get soil cement caps on them, and it's pretty much as simple as that. Now, let's see, a couple of more images. Now, this is another interesting thing that happened in this history. In 1974, again, the Washington office weighed in on all of this. Quote, "We have observed the use of many modern materials in the restoration and maintenance of our historic structures which have questionable value and which in many cases do permanent damage." And this is in direct reference to the misuse of cement, which became a big discovery in the 70s, you know, the wrong cement mortar and all of this. And of course, cement and soil cements and cement was ubiquitous in the Southwest. And so, in a response to this, in the Southwest, and I'm not sure exactly who was behind this, but in 1975, the Southwest region hired Dr. Denny Fenn from the University of Arizona, a soil scientist, to join the Park Service and work on these issues around how to best stabilize adobe. And Dr. Fenn spent 3 years working on this, and his primary idea was to construct test walls around in different locations, test walls that had a little history already. But he made it very scientific and very controlled about the types of chemicals to be used. Of course, the Darroweld was used, and these other silicones were used, as well as the EC330 was introduced. And around, you know, we had these test walls. And but as usual with the Park Service, at just about the time when success, and he started to note, and he wrote a report about, well, the Darroweld works, the EC330 works, you know, well, they terminated the program, and he went back to the university. That was it. No more scientific study. But here we have at Chaco, this Great Wall. And so I was in the Park Service at the time, had this great trip in 2004 where some of us got together and got Dr. Denny to come over and meet us, and let's take a look at those walls. They're still there. They're still there today, I'm sure. And so, you know, let's do a little evaluation. And, you know, sure enough, he had his notes and everything. And those acrylic emulsions and whatnot were still, you know, in fairly good condition after that 20-year period. So, of course, in a situation where they're in wall sections like this, we've learned that, you know, you can almost put anything in there, really. But the application of these two chemicals, the Darroweld and the Roplex, took off like wildfire around the Southwest. I mean, everybody started using one or the other of them as some sort of an admixture in either their adobe or their mortar, and we just see it as a ubiquitous. And finally, at Fort Union, which is right near here, about 100 miles up past in the direction of Vegas. 1956, Fort Union came into the National Monument, came into the Park Service. It's some 56 structures, 150,000 square feet of unroofed walls. It's located in this high plain of New Mexico. And to quote from the 19th century record of some of the soldiers who were there, maybe a soldier's wife, "Indeed, from the moment they were completed until their abandonment in 1891, the fort's adobe structures were in an almost constant state of unremitting deterioration." Well, you have to stop a minute and think, gee, did the Park Service know what they were getting into when they signed on to take care of all this stuff? I mean, really, it's like a hopeless task, like the myth of Sisyphus or something. So, but this Fort Union has this great history about what happened there and what was done. Between 1956 and 1958, excavations were done, site clearing, and some structural stabilization, which sometimes amounted to braces, basal repairs of walls, things like these chimneys back here were filled up with concrete and all kinds of things like that. In 1959 to 62, capping with soil cement adobes and spraying with silicone water repellent was the treatment of choice. So this is very important. In 1962, they went around the fort and they put soil cement caps everywhere on top, and they sprayed all the walls with the silicone stuff that was being used everywhere else. We saw pictures of spray. And this continued, the applying, with the addition of applying some soil cement structure coats, shelter coats in some areas. By 1981, there were some noted and recognized failures with this wall treatment. And so, at the time, all use of any chemicals, cements were discontinued at Fort Union. And I'm not exactly sure who's behind it. Probably Dave Battle, who was down here running Division of Conservation, was behind that whole deal. And then it was decided, okay, unamended plasters. That's what you're going to do, and they did from 1981 until about 1996. The staff at Fort Union mud plastered these walls. I have to hand it to them. But it didn't work out really well. It was certainly better than the previous treatment, but they couldn't keep after it. Too much work, not enough money, not enough staff. It couldn't happen. So this is where I came on the scene. In 1991, I met Frank Matero, and we started to launch a partnership and a cooperative agreement with the Graduate School of Historic Preservation there at UPenn. And Fort Union was one of the first sites to go to look at, first of all, some very material scientific things about how these plasters that are still remnant there can stay in place. And it began to grow into a larger concept of preservation strategies of what can happen at Fort Union. And it resulted in a wonderful collaboration, which I know is still underway, and Frank has now gone back to work at Fort Union to look at these things. And out of that work, several things emerged with the student, great credit to some of the students, particularly Bob Hartzler and Ann Oliver, who worked on this, graduates of Penn, was that, in 20, 30 years later, these cement caps were shown to be excellent treatments. If it wasn't for those, the walls would have been down. But at that time, when the Penn students did the survey, they were at the end of their life. They needed something had to happen, and so the decision had to be made. What about those soil cement caps? I didn't show a picture of Fort Bowie, but in Fort Bowie went through the same thing, cement caps everywhere. And in 1970, when this directive came out of the Washington office, the person in charge down there decided, we got to get rid of those soil cement caps. That's destroying the walls. Took them all off and started with some other kind of treatment a few years later, in desperation, when the walls just started to come down with the soil cement cap. So in 2001, a lot of other things happened here, but one fundamentally very important thing was the soil cement caps got put back on there, and they're performing quite well after 10, 12 years at this point. And just to make one final comment about the association with UPenn, coming back to Casa Grande, this is the wonderful thesis work that Elisa Del Bono did, where they looked at the materials of the Casa Grande and what was really happening at the surface of these materials. And what she showed is that the molecular carbonates, because it's a caliche type of material, it's a very wonderful material, were migrating in evaporation sequences of just humidity to the surface and case hardening the surface. And so it was like, wait a minute, everybody, don't touch it. Don't touch it, because it's weakening in its depth, but strengthening on the surface. So it's case hardening, leave it alone. And so as far as I know, there's no treatment program being recommended for Casa Grande. I have to say, Frank and I were talking about this last night, and he was using this. He was saying, these treatments with Adobe, it's sort of like shifting the deck chairs around on the Titanic. I'm quoting him. Shifting the deck. I went home thinking, that's exactly right. Except not completely, because I think we're making great strides and great progress. Where I work at Cornerstones, we use totally unamended plasters. We have plasters at the San Miguel Church here that are 5, 6 years old. They're just as good as we put them on 5 years ago. And so we go to extra trouble to do that. And so I'm out in the park sometimes talking about, let's don't forget about unamended earthen materials. There's a lot of potential there. So with that, thank you.